Welcome to the Pulsating Biology, and in today's video we are covering the chapter Respiration, lecture number 2 for the Olevels Biology. In this video we are going to learn about the uses of energy in living organism and each one of them in detail. When you tell about the energy, you need to understand that energy is required for all sorts of the metabolic reactions, whether they are catabolic or anabolic. That means all kinds of the reactions that are basically taking place in the human body. And for what reasons? The reasons we're going to learn by lining them up. So the first reason is the muscle contraction. The body requires the energy in a larger quantity in order to contract muscle and help them to perform their function very properly. The second that to be lined up is the protein synthesis. Protein is required by our body in the macromolecule quantity, we say, and that's why the protein synthesis is very important for our body. Thirdly, we say is the cell division. The cell division helps us in the somatic manner and all kinds of the divisions in our body. Next, we have the growth. The growth is very important for our bony structures and the skeleton. That's why the energy is required for the growth of the body. And then we say the active transport. When you talk about the active transport is basically a process in which the energy is required in order to basically transport the mechanism from the region of lower concentration to the region of higher concentration against the concentration gradient. Next, we say for generating the nerve impulse. As we know, our entire body works on the or the central nervous system works on the impulsation. We say that the energy is required for the generation of the nerve impulse. Lastly, we say that the energy is required to maintain the body temperature, that is also termed as the homeostasis, and larger amount of energy is required for all these of the reactions and all these that are lined up. We're going to learn about each of them in a more detail, that how the energy is required for the muscle contraction, how protein synthesis, cell division, growth, active transport, nerve impulse, and the body temperature, which is also termed as the homeostasis. Let's firstly talk about the muscle contraction. We have already learned that how the muscle is involved in the kind of the energy that is basically being released. When you talk about the muscle contraction, you need to realize that muscle contraction is very important in our body and all for the functioning of all the muscles that are basically placed in different parts of our body. A few of the examples for you to understand. We'll begin with a very common example for the muscle contraction is the peristalsis. We all know that peristalsis is the upward movement of the food molecules because of the contraction and the relaxation of the two muscles that were involved in the stomach, that were the circular muscle and the longitudinal muscle. Next is the inhaling and the exhaling. The inhaling and the exhaling involve two muscles that are known as the intercostal muscles, that involve the external intercostal muscle and the internal intercostal muscle. These are the three examples. When we say the pupil constriction, we have not really learned about the pupil constriction, and it is not in a much detail in your syllabus for now, but you need to understand that when you talk about the pupil constriction, it means either the pupil radial or it basically constricts. So we talk about the pupil size in the pupil constriction, as it also consists of the muscles. Next, we say the sphincter muscle. The sphincter muscle, we have learned many kinds of the sphincter muscles in the human digestive system that is present in the GIT. But the sphincter muscle we are talking here about is related to the anus. Next, we say is the vasoconstriction and the vasodilation. When you talk about the vasoconstriction and vasodilation, we mean the muscles that are present in the blood vessels. When you talk about the muscles that are present in the blood vessel, you need to understand that the vasoconstriction and vasodilation mean whenever there is less amount of the flow of the blood, and whenever there are more amount of the flow of the blood, that means there's more constriction in the blood vessels. These are some of the examples that I've lined up are related to the muscle constriction for you to understand it in a more better way. Let's talk about the protein synthesis. When you talk about the protein synthesis, you need to understand that there are some protein related enzyme, let's say the pepsin, let's say the amylase, and let's take another example, that is the lipase. All of them are the enzymes that are related to the protein. When you talk about the protein synthesis, you also need to understand that hemoglobin plays a very important role. The hemoglobin is basically present as the HP in your blood. Then we have the myoglobin also, that is present into your muscles. And then you talk about another example, we can take an example of insulin that is produced by the beta cells of your islets of Langerhans. Then the last example we can take is the of antibodies. All of these are involved in the protein synthesis, as we know that how much important this the protein basically holds in our body. Now, these are few of the examples that are lined up related to your muscle contractions and the protein. We're going to discuss the other also in a similar manner for you to understand in a more better way. Let's talk about the cell division. When you talk about the cell division, you need to understand that cell division is a very important, whether it is on a somatic base, that means on the growth level, or whether it is on the germline cell. But when you talk about the cells that are basically present in your body, for example, let's take an example of RBC. RBC are the red blood cells that are present in a larger quantity in your blood. We said that basically new RBCs are formed to replace the cell that dies. In such a manner, we say the cell division takes place. The new ones basically replaces the ones that have been died, replaces the died ones, and we say that these terms is known as the cell division. Therefore, cell division is very important in order to reorder the amount of the cells that are basically passed out. Next, when you talk about the growth, they are the energy that are required for the growth. We say that it is because of the permanent increase in the mass. The energy is required for the growth for the permanent increase in the mass, whether the mass of a muscle or a mass of a body. We say, for example, we say the plants grow, wherever we say that the animals grow. This example helps us to understand that how for the growth purposes, basically whether it's talking about the plant or animal, it is related to all kinds of living organisms except for the virus. We said that the growth is very important in order to move on to the next step of their life. We took an example of active transport and how the energy is required for the active transport. Active transport is a transport mechanism which involves energy directly in the form of ATP. ATP is the adenosine triphosphate basically that is formed into your body. And how does the active transport basically works? It works in such a manner that it basically the movement of molecules from the region of lower concentration to higher concentration against the concentration gradient, but in the presence of energy. Whenever there is a less amount of the energy is present or the energy is not present, we said that active transport does not take place. And where does it take place? Let's take an example of active transport that very commonly take place in the root hair cells and the transport of the ions. Whenever we talk about the ions that are being transported in the root hair cells from the root to the upper part of the body of the plant, we say that the active transport is basically taking place. Or you can take another example related to the human being, that is in the intestine. The soluble glucose or the amino acid that are taken up by the intestine is by the process of the active transport by the blood. So when you talk about the soluble, you can take an example of soluble glucose, or you can talk about the amino acids that are very commonly taken up from the blood into the human body of the intestine. So these are the two very common examples of the transport. Being a biology student, all of you, I'm sure, must be very aware of the nerve impulse and the generation and the importance of nerve impulse that it basically holds in the human body. When you talk about the nerve impulse, you need to know about the instinct of a nerve impulse or the stimulation of nerve impulse. When you talk about the stimulation of nerve impulse, you need to understand that whenever a human body touches any hot object, it stimulates and creates or generates a nerve impulse in order to reaction of the body to basically pins up their hand. For example, if you touch any sort of a hot object, for example, if you touch an iron, your body gives you an instinct that there's a hot object, you need to take off your body, otherwise it will harm you. This is what we say about the stimulation, that it produces or generates a nerve impulse that basically helps you to affect the organ or give the reaction. When you talk about this, the very common example that I've given you is basically included in the reflex action. The reflex action are those actions that are taking place suddenly and with the response of a body. So the reflex action includes all of these muscles, and also it includes all the glands that were basically hyperactive and allows all the reactions or stimulations to basically pass on to the effectors and at the end of the motor neurons. So it includes the stimulators that are also known as the receptors. It also includes the effectors, and it also includes the motor neurons. If you want to learn about this in a more detail, I'm going to give you an overview that receptor are those sensory or sensory receptors that basically receive the stimuli. When we talk about the effector, these are the effector that basically brings back the stimuli of the reaction to the separate organ. When we talk about the motor neuron, these are the neurons that are present between the brain and the spinal cord, that is within the central nervous system.